gonna turn off my video. So can you state your name, age, and your role in WRI, I guess?
Sure. So my name is Amanda MacFarlane. I am 23, and I am a research and development okay. We can start that again because this is going to be long. I'm sorry, y'all.
It's alright.
Alright. My name is Amanda MacFarlane. I'm 23, and I'm a research and developer for WRI.
Right. What country were you born from, and where did you grow up?
So I was born in the United States. I lived here most of my life. When I was about 11, though, I lived in the Philippines for 2 years and came back when I was around 14, right before that.
All right. I guess where did you start your period is one of the first questions.
Okay, so I started my period when I was between the grades 5th grade and 6th grade. I didn't really know what was going on necessarily at that time. Usually you're taught kind of sex ed and whatnot through my system in middle school, so I kind of missed that section and had to learn it on my own.
Oh, yeah, okay. Were there any difficulties about getting a period for the first time in terms of like not knowing who to ask or not knowing what period pains were?
Yes, so I grew up in a mixed modern family household. So my mom died when I was 8. So one of the major challenges for me was not having really a female role model available. I had my stepmom, but we weren't quite as close as she came into my life when I was about 10. So I had to learn a lot of these things really by myself, realistically. When I first got my period, I literally just took a towel and stuck it into my pants to be absorbent, as I didn't really know what pads were or how to use them. How I actually got introduced to pads was my stepmom found the towel in the laundry and realized what was going on and sat me down to talk about pads in general. I didn't really get cramps until I was probably 16. I think I'm pretty lucky in that way, actually. I had no idea what cramps were until I was basically doubled over on my floor. So I think growing up mostly with males, my dad and my brother, they didn't really know anything about it, didn't have a ton of interest in learning about it until it kind of started affecting me. But when I finally got cramps, it would get so bad sometimes during school that I would almost throw up, and I would have to run to the bathroom 3 or 4 times during my period or on a certain day. My cosmetology teacher actually told me to consider going on birth control because I was having such a hard time keeping the nausea down during class.
Thank you. I'm so sorry to hear about your mom too.
It's all good. Unfortunately, we can't pick our history.
Yeah. So in school, I guess, regarding education about menstruation, what kind of stuff did you learn, and like what finally clicked for you when you learned about that?
So to be honest, whatever menstruation education we had, I do not remember very well. I think I missed most of it because most of the development parts, the parts about actually receiving menstruation, was in middle school. And in middle school, I was in the Philippines, and there they didn't talk about it until much later, because in other countries it's more normal to see periods show up later in life, versus for me it showed up when I was around 11. So I kind of just had this gap where honestly what I learned about sex, about periods, about being a woman in general was sort of self-learned. I'm very grateful for the internet. Had to learn a lot of things from that area of life through the internet and sort of just different forums and things like that. There's a lot of misinformation though, so you have to sift through it, kind of figure out what it is for your own. I also learned somewhat from talking with my other female friends. They also could kind of explain some of their experiences or what was going on and kind of relate to how I was doing. I realized that for me, my period wasn't as heavy as other girls, and so I feel like at times my friends would ask me for pads and it would be very frequent, or they would use a different type of absorbency than I was, And being at that age, you don't carry a purse or anything, so you don't have pads on hand necessarily, and it can be hard to find them. So for me, I feel like my education really was self-taught. I grew up not in a very sex-positive environment. Like, my family was totally open with me about kind of that aspect of life, but one, I didn't want to hear it because it wasn't a female experience kind of relation. And at the same time, it was also in schools, I grew up in a conservative town, so talking about periods or whatnot is still somewhat taboo. It's not seen as something you just talk about with everyone, and boys would definitely not be in the room when that conversation was had.
Yeah. Since you have both been in the Philippines and in the US, what are some of the differences about how both countries and their cultures regard just periods and menstruation in general?
In the Philippines, women's issues in general, I think, are sort of on the back burner. When you have a country that, has poverty and has a lot of different corruption and things like that you have to deal with on a day-to-day basis, that may not be number one priority, and we see that all over the world. And so one of the things I remember the most about the Philippines that was really interesting, and I felt like not seen from a female perspective, is if you went out in public, a public bathroom was not free, at least in no sanitary conditions. So if there was a bathroom that offered you toilet paper, you had to pay for it. And so if you didn't have the money to go to like a mall bathroom, you didn't have access to that facility. And in a mall, in like a certain area, that might be your only option. And so it's not like here where you can find a clean bathroom at every corner at a shop or something. There, it really is like there's somebody at the door and they say, pay me and I'll let you go to the bathroom and here's some tissue. Like, that's how it works. It's not open and available to everyone. So I can't imagine what that must be like to be on your period and not have money to even do that, transaction that you might need for being able to deal with your period.
I didn't know that was happening in the Philippines. My cousin that just came over here, she was talking about how great it felt to go into a bathroom and see all the not free, but like available pads and tampons available for girls to just use if they don't have any on hand. And so something similar, like what you were describing, was happening in Vietnam too. But it's just really sad to see how the system in general and culture just regards women and makes them feel less than themselves.
Yeah. I think it's also just they don't even consider it, to be honest with you. It's like, it's really easy for a woman to understand, like, if you go out in public and there isn't a bathroom available, that's a big problem for most women once a month, like, and that might be like a week. So 1/4 of your life, essentially, it's going to be a problem. But I think to some extent, if that's not considered, then, it's half the population has to suffer for it.
Yeah. On top of just in natural, like, living is not built for women in menstruation, how does, I guess, Philippine culture also regard period? Like, just women having periods, do they have any, like, taboos against it too?
Yes. So I think, in general, one of the taboos is around tampons, and just things that go inside of the vagina for menstrual aid versus exterior. I'm pretty sure I don't know a single girl that used tampons in the Philippines other than me. It was just one of those things where virginity is, the top thing. It's supposed to be, the crowning jewel of like womanhood in that region. And so even something like that is still considered taboo. Like, I know my stepmom does not use tampons at all. And so I think for that, it's not seen as necessarily as clean. If you're a girl that uses that, there might be sort of like it's almost weird because there's nothing flirty about it, but you're almost seen like a bit more flirty, a bit more open, more Americanized. And Americanized is not a good term there. For them, an American is usually a very loud person who's rude. And I think part of that comes from an assertiveness that you see in American women and a streak of independence, where there it's more about community. And there are good things that come from that. For example, I didn't shave my legs for like the whole 2 years I lived there, which was a total break from America where they expect you to have your legs shaved. So there are trade-offs to kind of what the standards are here versus there, but at the same time, there's definitely something where it's like a lot of girls would leak, and I feel like that's more common in their culture, and I'm not sure why, if it's the prevalence of pads, but I would have girls ask me to check the back of their skirt for leaking probably 2 to 3 times a day. And so that's kind of the thing where there is that community with women, but it's also you don't want it known. It was embarrassing to have that on your skirt for the world to see. And guys, middle school guys in America are bad. There it's also too about it. They have this tendency to be grossed out by it, which I hate to tell them that's where they came from, is from a woman's vagina, and otherwise it would have been menstruation. So I think for them, it's, having a tampon or a pad around them was considered this, like, gross thing. Like, literally, when you're in middle school, you could toss a tampon into a group of boys, and they would literally, like, scream and disperse like you just threw, like, I don't know, a bunch of garbage their way.
That's hilarious. When you were in the Philippines, did you always have access to menstruation products like pads and tampons? I know probably not tampons, and also is that kind of supply different from region to region where you were living?
Yes, so it definitely depends on region, and the Philippines is still a very hierarchical culture. So there are the haves and there are the have-nots. If you're a have-not, you probably don't have as much access. If you're somebody who has money, comes from generational wealth, you have access to grocery stores. Because there, a grocery store that we think of today, where it's like a supermarket where you can buy everything you need in one stop, was a novelty there. I remember when a new mall was erected in the city where I lived, and it was a huge deal because you could go in there. It was fully air conditioned. It had everything you needed as kind of a one-stop shop, and that was somewhat novel in that area. There were other malls, but they maybe weren't as air conditioned or weren't as clean or weren't as well kept or well stocked. And so I think that's really where the difference lies. For me, I never had really a problem accessing menstruation products. For me, I felt sort of a need to stock up on things like you might stock up for other things like toilet paper. But that doesn't mean, for example, if I left tampons at home, they were available to buy, but not nearly in the selection you have here. That means I wouldn't have them for that day, and you might have to do, the toilet paper sort of makeshift pad to put into your underwear, or you might have to ask all your friends around, and that might be hard to do in sort of a secretive manner, unless they're also in the bathroom with you. So definitely, if you lived in a area that was under-resourced or that didn't have the same levels of access, you might have to go to a corner store, which may be run by your neighbor, and you might not want to have sort of that conversation. And that's kind of the thing. A lot of people shop in sort of like these corner bodegas of varieties for what they need, and they might not carry a variety of options. It might just be one thing. So you don't necessarily have that same option and availability that you have in the US.
Yeah, it sounds like if you need a specific something that's really hush-hush, you better have your one person that is the supplier on the down low. So that could be a barrier to getting these things too. Very interesting to learn about. Or when girls have experience when they experience period pains in the Philippines, how comfortable are they feeling to reach out to someone like an adult and seek help? Like, how do they just talk about their menstruation, any abnormalities about it?
Yeah. So one of the really interesting things that's different about the Philippines versus the US is the teacher-student relationship. Here, it's very obviously we're very worried about maintaining a professional environment and also a safe environment for both children and adults. And so there's sort of this barrier or this sort of distancing that happens, and for good reason. You know, we have evidence that that's necessary. But in other cultures where it's a community environment, right? It's all about the community. It's all about the general welfare. Your child is like, at least in my school, the teacher was basically an aunt or an uncle. Like, they treated you like that. I went to a private school, so that experience might have been a bit different. But for them, you would refer to, they had the canteen and the women that worked there, you'd refer to them as a Filipino word, as older sister, ate. So you would refer to her as your older sister. So it was a much closer experience, I think, in general. You know, when they took, like, you could do something called utang at the canteen, and what utang means is basically to put it on your tab. So it means you're not going to pay up front, but you will pay in the future. And they would literally mark it down with a pen and a piece of paper and expect you to pay it back and trust you to pay it back. And so I think that's where the difference is. And I had no problem talking to teachers, especially female teachers, about kind of all different types of aspects, you know, about like what their dreams are or anything like that. So I think that's one of the special things about it that made it a bit different. Most teachers were pretty understanding or wouldn't question it. I had one girl who had really bad cramps almost every single month, and she'd bring a heating pad to class and have to plug it into the wall and sit there with it. Or she had like a special kind of seat chair thing that was supposed to help her. And so she would use those items in class, and it wasn't really talked about as much. It wasn't really brought up by teachers, especially male teachers, because it isn't really seen as their place to question it. But the female teachers are definitely different than here. They would come to school with their hair wet and just kind of comb it in front of everyone, which is, everyone did that. Nobody comes to their hair blow dried. So it was just a very different community environment.
That is actually a really interesting point that you brought up. And it's different here in US for sure. And also when I was speaking to my cousin in Vietnam, she had the complete like opposite experience of a student-teacher relationship where she said that some woman teacher might understand if they talk in code, but for men teachers, like, it was a no-no. Like, they would just give up and like sit through the pain in school. And it's like super strict there too. But in the Philippines, it sounds like women actually get the care and attention they need whenever they have like any problems with their menstruation, and that's really awesome to know about too.
Yeah. I think one of the main differences and one of the most fascinating things about the Philippines is it is a matriarchal culture. You know, here we live in America, it's patriarchal. The dad is the head of the family, the man, whatever. In the Philippines, it is the mother. Like, the grandmother is, you know, she's the woman, the Lola, the person who has kind of the power, and that generational connection is much stronger there, I would say. And so, to some extent, having that relationship with women in a power situation, I think helps that a lot.
That's so awesome. So when you were in the Philippines, I know you mentioned some of the problems that even in public women can't get access to supplies and stuff like that. But overall, the menstrual education was pretty good about just letting girls know that it's normal, and if it's any abnormalities, speak up and it'll be addressed. Is there anything else that the Philippines, I guess, undeveloped country, can improve about just providing more for women in that regards?
Yeah, so I do want to emphasize that it is sort of a closed doors situation. So if you're going to talk to a teacher, you can talk to her, you know, privately. You can pull her aside. Or for a male teacher, because you might not want to necessarily get into the details, you might say you need to go to the bathroom during a lesson and it's for a woman's reason, or you wouldn't necessarily say the word period. So it is behind closed doors. And when it comes to matriarchy, the other kind of half of it is the country's been run by a long line of men. So I think there's a really interesting dichotomy, because traditionally the Philippines is a matriarchy, but some of the cultures coming through, the U.S. controlled the Philippines for a couple of years, and I think that does definitely have an effect. I think for us, generally, better is probably just bringing the guys into the conversation, honestly. That was definitely one of the things that I felt like was the biggest gap when you're a young girl, is being separated from men or boys in general because it's a woman's issue, right? But the thing about it is everyone can benefit from being aware. Like, one of the things I remember the most is that teen pregnancy in the Philippines is at an exceptionally high rate. And while period poverty or period issues and pregnancy aren't connected necessarily directly, they are related. And that has to do with education and access. And so I think increasing both of those is definitely paramount, especially in communities that might not have as many resources. But I think at the same time, it really is tale as old as time for inequity. Because if you live in a less funded school district or area, or you can't afford to go to a private school, you might have that sort of barrier. So I think first dealing with inequity is the first thing in general. And I think we see that here too. We go to UT, there are pads and tampons laid out in the bathroom because we have initiatives that affect that. But in other places, like, in my high school, that was not there. You might have one of those little turn things where you put a quarter in it, and then out comes, like, your generic tampon or pad, but half the time those were empty. So at the same time, I think it really depends on breaking the barriers for equity when it comes to social class, when it comes to economic income. It's not something anybody picks to do. It's not something that women should feel ashamed of, because literally mankind depends on it. Without periods, without kind of the cycle, you really don't have humanity. And unfortunately for us, man has developed in such a way where periods happen about 12 times a year, and that's actually an evolutionary advantage to other species that go through heat, and then they only have that one opportunity to raise offspring a year. So for us, it's been a great tool for us to move forward as a species, but now that it's been so looked down upon, so a private conversation, it really has taken away from, this is a miracle of how we're able to survive and grow and develop.
Yeah, thanks. That was actually pretty cool to listen to. Even for the U.S., I feel like menstrual education could also be improved greatly, because I'm with you too. I don't really remember what I'm supposed to learn about it. I don't think I learned anything about menstruation on a normal basis besides biology. Even then, it's harder to understand because I'm like, make the connection that this is happening to my body right now. And all I remember is sex education, honestly. But even though we have a bunch of education and resources here in the U.S., it's not being utilized to an extent that we should, to normalize, like, just menstruating and the stigma behind it, just eradicate it. I don't know why that is.
It's crazy.
Yeah, it is.
What I remember from biology the most is, like, mitosis, meiosis, and the various stages, and that isn't even human development at all.
Yeah.
So that's what's, or the mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell.
Yes.
It's things that, what we learn are on such a microscopic level, the day-to-day connection isn't there. And here's another story for you. When I was a kid, I remember this was like a big deal. So I went on a field trip, and I had this pair of underwear that I packed, or that my mom packed or whatever, that said sweet and sassy on them. So if those teachers are out there and wondering what happened, here's what happened. Brought them on the field trip, lost them in the locker room, and they forced all the boys out to leave. And I was left there with a bunch of girls, and they're like, okay, we found this pair of underwear here. Who's not wearing underwear? And it says sweet and sassy on it. And then it was like this whole thing of like these girls kind of snickering at each other, like, ooh, who's wearing that? But it's just like what you buy at Justice or whatever, you know, like you're a kid. They put random things on it. And so to make it like cute or whatever. But I remember it was like mortifying for me, like absolutely mortifying. It didn't matter that the boys had left the room. I was like, oh my gosh, I don't want to be the sweet and sassy underwear girl. So I went home just wearing like my wet swimsuit under my jeans and then a towel on top of that. And I heard on the bus on the way home, like the two coaches or the people who were supervising us were saying, well, we took all the boys out of the room so it wasn't embarrassing. And it was so embarrassing. Like everyone was trying to figure it out, and I was like, okay, this isn't a positive environment. Like now I have to think about what underwear choices I make when I'm like 8 years old because it might be embarrassing. So.
Oh man.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh wait, I totally forgot. How long have we been going? I forgot to stop the interview so we could do intersections, but you know what? It's okay.
You're good. I'm at 26 minutes if you want to stop it.
I only have one more question. It's not worth it.
Okay.
So with your involvement in WRI, what do you think WRI can play a role in menstruation education and period poverty in the U.S. and also internationally?
Yes. So I think one of the things about WRI, right, we have all these groups trying to focus on eradicating period poverty, helping period poverty in every corner of the world, right? And even groups that are maybe similar in a mission. And I think one of the things I like the most about WRI is its willingness to collaborate. You know, I like to say this, is that if you really care about the cause, you will collaborate to help and bring up other people with you because you care about it being on a mass scale. If you care about profit, if you care about, you know, just simply being in your own world or gaining whatever you can from that, whether it's notoriety or power or whatever, then you won't because you put that first. And so I feel like we're definitely in a community where we put, you know, women first, where we put our advancements first because we're not afraid to necessarily talk and share and collaborate with other groups that are trying to do the same thing, which I think is smart and a lot of nonprofits really need to do to make the biggest effect they can. I think for us, what we're trying to do stateside is really empower women, give them an opportunity to help around the world because people do want to help. They do relate. Like they may not be the same, but you're connected by the same biology that goes back, you know, millions of years. And so I think for us, it's being able to be that gateway for a lot of women, the ability to kind of talk about it more, to be able to say, you know, I take pictures with like pads or tampons, or I share my period story, and it's not weird. And I think it's also opened up channels for people in my own life. Like I talk to my dad about kind of what I'm doing or what I'm thinking, or try to go through thoughts about it, where before when I was a kid I was, you know, worried about that, about talking about periods in general. I think for even just different people in my life, it's just opened up a conversation that wasn't there before. And for people overseas, I think it's the ability for us to focus on, you know, aiding rather than being a savior. A lot of people, I think, try to be a savior, kind of like this white knight or this perfect, you know, person that has such aspirations that they can go into a community and just save them. But these are people too, and I think that's where people miss out on it. And people don't need saving, they might just need some help. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's the way of the world, you know. Definitely, you know, 70 years from now, I'm going to need some help if I'm still around. And that's just the human experience. And I think for us, it's about being able to reach them from a human level, from a equal level, and be like, hey, we want to help. We want to be able to bring greater opportunity for you through this program, and you're going to be the one leading it. So I don't want to ever say, you know, I don't want to be in an organization that doesn't put who they're trying to serve first. And I think that's what WRI does different. You know, we don't ever make a decision without considering where we're going, what that means about their livelihood, about their way of life, their religion, what is and isn't taboo and where we think the greatest improvement can be and what they really need, because it's so easy for us to get into our heads and focus on what we think they need versus what they actually need. And so I think for us, that's really where we're trying to make that connection. So what do they actually need, and then how do we make something that serves that? And so for us, being able to have a social entrepreneurship sort of program for these women is life-changing. It gives them autonomy, it gives them ability to continue education, possibly bring an income for their family rather than maybe having to set some aside for period products. That's what we're aiming for, and I'm really excited for what's coming up next.
That was awesome. The thing that you mentioned about considering the culture that we're coming in to help, that was a very different perspective that I've heard. That basically concludes our interview, but before we do, is there anything that I missed on asking you, or anything that you wanted to bring up but we didn't get to touch on?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'll kind of make my inspire the world statement here.
Yes.
Is that I grew up in a small town, and I love so many things about my small town, but honestly, I never dreamt really bigger than it. And I feel like a lot of people are in a similar situation where they feel like there's only me. There's only my ability to make such a small impact that the ceiling really is the limit. It isn't even the glass ceiling, it's below that. And I feel like for so many people, for women, for men, for everybody in the community, if you're non-gender conforming, you feel like there may be a limit on you, depending on where you're born, on what your income is, on what your family background is, your status in life. But I think what I've learned through this process and what I want to emphasize is, if you feel like you have the ability to make a change, you need to find people that believe in that and that back you, and you need to keep pushing forward because it's possible and you can do it. I think for us, the beauty of it is, right, like we always talk about all these companies being built out of a garage. We didn't even have a garage to build things out of. We were literally out of our homes and out of somewhere where someone would lend us space. And so I think it's do as much as you can, follow your passion, and don't limit yourself, because you'll be amazed what people see in you or what you can make possible if you just collaborate with other people. You're right, there's only so much you can do yourself, but it's more than that if you add other people to the mix, and what you can create together is better than what you could each create separately. And so don't be afraid to try things.
Yes, I got chills. Thank you so much for that too. I think that's going to be really awesome if we add it to the documentary. Yeah, I also wanted to thank you for your time, because I know it was a little frustrating to set up. But you can stop the video recording now.
Oh, hold on.